Also, let me get your reaction on that day in November of 2001 when the executive order was issued. What was your initial reaction to it? We'll start here, Mr. Blanton, and we'll just go down the table.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll defer to my expert legal advisor here. We're a co-plaintiff in this lawsuit on the constitutional and legal issues because my expertise is the practical ones. How does it actually work? And I don't think any of us have to be an expert in organizational process to understand if Julie Nixon Eisenhower's kids get to exercise this privilege, we're in for delay. It just doesn't make any sense, just from a practical point of view. At some point, the Supreme Court held that privilege erodes over time, and surely at the time it gets to the kids, it should be gone. That's just practical. And in November 2001, what I loved the most, Mr. Chairman, and I put those quotes in my testimony, were the predictions made about the executive order by the President, said this is a fair and reasonable set of procedures. By Ari Fleischer at the White House press room, he said, oh, this is more information is going to come out, and it's going to come out in a more orderly process. And then before this committee of the House, by the acting Assistant Attorney General, who said, oh, this is just a clear, sensible, and workable procedures for administering the Act. Well, we had a fair, reasonable, workable, sensible, clear, orderly process producing millions of records before this executive order, and we haven't had it since. We know enough to know every one of those quotes was not true.
Thank you.
Thank
you for that response.
Mr. Chairman, if I may
Yes.
interject, I echo Tom Blanton's comments, but as someone who has worked on a number of presidential administrations, what I know is that every one of them, regardless of their party affiliation, Democrat or Republican, they want the public to think they walk on water, that they are without error, without sin. And what I find in my research is that there is always a public face and a private face. And that if the heirs to that administration, if the children, if the representatives of a presidential administration, of a president, have control of materials, they are going to sanitize, weed out material that will make the president look less than spectacular or successful. And John Quincy Adams said that the historian's principal religion is getting at the truth, speaking the truth, you see. I don't want to be too self-righteous and too cynical here, but my experience in 43 years of writing history about presidents and politics, and it's quite human. People want to be seen in history as successful, as wise, as sensible, and of course, they're always less than that. But the public is well served by knowing what they were doing in the fullest possible way.
Thank you for that response. Dr. Nelson, go ahead.
Let me add to that, if I may. I think that we have a lot of evidence in the papers of the presidential papers that were donated to the government, because almost all of those have provisions for the heirs to examine and to finally talk about access on the long run when the president's dead. And we have consistently found that the presidential families, they vary, some more than others, but evidence is held back. And now there's a difference between the fact that Margaret Truman did not release the letters her father sent to her mother until her mother died. That's perhaps a matter of privacy, but it goes so much farther than that, in that we have situations where families won't even give documents to the government, but will let them sit in presidential libraries, but they are not accessioned to the government. And we just have constant interference. We have that record. We know that actually exists.
Thank you for that. Mr. Henson or Mr. Nelson? He'll pass. Okay.
I I'd let Mr. Henson go first.
Go
but
ahead.
I do have some answers myself.
Go ahead, Mr. Anderson.
Well, I just wanted to respond to your last question, as sort of how we felt on on that fateful day. I think the others have certainly spoken to the practical aspects of this. My testimony reflects, I think, the sort of philosophical underpinnings with which we approach our work. And for us, the executive order seemed like such a breathtaking departure in. Well, I mean, there are two sort of famous quotations that relate to our work. The first is, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And then the carving in front of the National Archives, the past is prologue. We do not learn anything from the past unless that past is reflected accurately. And everything about this executive order, threw up red flags in terms of the maintaining the authenticity of the record. And we've been very much involved in it ever since.
Thank you for that, Mr. Nelson. Would you speak to the constitutional?
Yes,
issues?
being a lawyer and having my perceptions and reactions skewed by that fact, I'll address your questions as a lawyer. The presidential privilege the Supreme Court has emphasized is something that belongs to the executive branch, to the government. It does not belong to any individual person. Its primary custodian is the president, the incumbent president, but the Supreme Court did recognize that a former president, due to his unique relationship to the office that he held, can at least make a claim of executive privilege, not one that's binding on the sitting president or the sitting members of the executive branch, but he at least has authority to claim it. But what authority does a private person designated as a representative by other private persons, namely the family of a deceased or incapacitated former president, have to assert this privilege that belongs to the executive branch of the United States government? None at all. What expertise or knowledge does that individual have that would even serve as a basis for a rational exercise of the government's privilege? None at all. And we saw this to a limited extent when President Reagan's representative asserted privilege as to 11 documents. And we don't really know anything about who this representative is or what her qualifications were. But the documents chosen appeared to be purely arbitrary. They were similar in character to the subjects of documents that had been produced. In one case, the document had actually been previously cleared for production by President Reagan's representatives several months earlier, and they simply just happened to claim privilege as to a second copy of it. In another, the subject was Nancy Reagan's use of military aircraft. And in addition to the legal and constitutional problems, I think, and of course the problems that have been alluded to before of whitewashing reputations, there's just a question when you assign this task to a representative who has no qualifications for it, what is the outcome going to be? At best, arbitrariness. At worst, the possibility for cover-up and actions taken to protect the reputations of those that the representative has been appointed to represent. Now, I'll also respond as a lawyer to your second question, which was how did I feel when I read the order? I remember that very distinctly because the very first case that I worked on in private practice was a case called Public Citizen v. Burke, where the Reagan Justice Department had issued an order that purported to direct the archivist to defer to any claim of privilege made by former President Nixon. And as one of former President Nixon's lawyers at that time, we intervened to help defend that Reagan Justice Department directive. And we lost that case. It was not only the first case I ever worked on, but one of the rare and first cases that I lost. And the D.C. Circuit said, this is just ridiculous. You can't give a former office holder the power to direct the actions of incumbent members of the executive branch. That's an abdication of the executive's authority to take care that the laws be faithfully exercised. So when I read that order, it was deja vu all over again, and my reaction was, wait a second, I lost this case already. How can they try this again? And I'm still wondering that.
Mr. Nelson, it sounds as though through your testimony you're preparing for another trial.
Could I just say, Mr.
Yeah,
Chairman, just a final word, that when that executive order was issued, it put me in mind of what the German philosopher Hegel said, that the only thing we ever learn from history is that we never learn.
That's right. Dr. Dallek, on that note, let me ask you, can you share with us, and I heard some of it in your testimony
Yes.
already, give us some examples of some presidential records, research that would not have been possible had access to privileged information had not been granted.
Sure. Well, we were talking earlier about Henry Kissinger's telephone transcripts. And, Mr. Chairman, I can assure you that they are highly revealing of a variety of things, not only about the interactions of the personalities of the President and his first National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State, but also on larger policy questions about Vietnam, about the Middle East. It is, I find, so timely to read these materials now because they're so revealing as to dilemmas that we continue to confront and need to address. Now, Dr. Kissinger wanted these materials closed until 5 years after his death, and then there was supposed to be a committee that would vet the requests of people to gain access to those materials. But as Tom Blanton pointed out to me, he was part of an effort to get these materials open. And I must tell you, I'm very excited about bringing out this book in less than 2 months because I think it's so revelatory as to the realities that went on behind the scenes. Again, the public face, the private face. I think it will be highly instructive to the public to see the kinds of things. I won't enter into the expletives deleted, but they're there in the book. It's amazing the way these men would speak, the things they would say about all sorts of people, about foreign countries, about what they knew as to the limits of what they were doing in relation, for example, to Vietnam. I think there are such lessons to be seen from that in relations to the current war in Iraq.